Greetings, I'm Bill Fletcher. I'm with the campaign to end the Moroccan occupation in the Western Sahara. And today we're going to have this discussion about the Western Sahara. Now, unfortunately, at least in the United States, when you mention the name the Western Sahara, let alone the conflict that's been going on there for decades, many people have no idea what you're talking about. You say Western Sahara and they think you're talking about a western part of the Sahara Desert, as opposed to an actual location that you can find on a map. The Western Sahara is embroiled in a conflict that goes back, one could argue goes back to the 19th century, but certainly involved an anti-colonial fight against the Spanish, a war that engaged the indigenous people, the Sahrawis, against the Mauritanians and the Moroccans, and then a longer conflict that has been between the Sahrawis and the Moroccans having occupied about 2/3 of the territory of this northwest piece of Africa. If you're not looking at a map, the Western Sahara is west of Algeria, north of Mauritania, south of Morocco, and sort of northwest of Mali. And it is a population that has been made up of largely nomadic peoples, but there are certain important cities in the Western Sahara. And this conflict that I'm making mention of is what we're going to be discussing today. And we have this incredible opportunity to do that with two people who know an immense amount about the situation and about why it should be important to each of you who is watching this video. So we have with us Caitlin Thomas, who's an attorney who was formerly an official with the United Nations operations in the Western Sahara. She was in charge of legal affairs, and she supervised the development of the interview process that led to the 1999 Western Sahara voter list, which we'll be talking about. She's the author of The Emperor's Clothes, The Naked Truth About Western Sahara, which I highly recommend. We also have with us Professor Stephen Zunas, who's a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. He's a co-author with Jacob Mundy of Western Sahara War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. And I want to welcome both of you to this discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So we're doing this discussion in the middle of March of 2020, but I want to go back a little bit.
2021, actually.
2021, excuse me, thank you. I want to go back a little bit and set the stage. So the Western Sahara was occupied by the Spanish from the 19th century, late 19th century until 1975. And one of the things for anyone reading this, reading about the situation, probably will wonder, as I did, why did the Spanish make such a mess out of this with the decolonization? Why was this not, as other decolonizations in other parts of the continent, where the colonial power withdraws, they pull down the flag, and the people that are there, the indigenous people, start raising a new flag, and they start off on a new path? I mean, what made this so complicated? I'd like both of you to answer that.
Well, Spain, like Portugal, was under a fascist dictatorship, and economically they weren't as strong as the British and French and others to set up a nice neo-colonial relationship. So they held on to their African colonies longer than the other European colonizers. But it was both international pressure and the beginnings of an armed struggle by the Polisario Front in 1972, they decided it was finally time to give up the territory. But their withdrawal happened to end up coinciding with the long and ultimately fatal illness of Generalissimo Franco, the fascist dictator that had ruled the country since the 1930s. And the United States, concerned that this new country would be under the leadership of the leftist Polisario Front. And Kissinger's word, we can't have another Angola on the western coast of Africa, pressured a reluctant Spain to break its promise for an act of self-determination and to allow for the temporary administrative partition of the territory between Morocco controlling the bulk of the territory and Mauritania controlling the southern third. Both had irredentist claims they had taken to the International Court of Justice, but which the World Court found had no merit. They reiterated the right of self-determination. Indeed, a UN investigation at that time also underscored the overwhelming majority of the population did want independence under the Polisario, not under Mauritanian or Moroccan control. But concerned about the instability in Portugal when their fascist government finally fell in the previous year, the U.S. didn't want a possible war between Spain and Morocco, and with the promise of dramatically increasing the rent on U.S. military bases and other incentives, the Spaniards reluctantly did give in to this partition plan. And then, of course, Morocco never allowed for the act of self-determination to take place and basically ended up taking the territory over directly.
Caitlin, this may be a naive question, but why did the United Nations not somehow intervene as this thing was going down the tubes? What was stopping them?
Well, they actually...
No, actually, Stephen, I was asking Caitlin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, because I can't seem to get on the screen, full screen, so you may have to see someone else's picture on there. The reason is basically the United States. The United States prevented Spain from doing what it wanted to do back in 1974. We should actually back up a bit, because I think people should realize that after the Second World War, the whole legal integration of the world changed. What was formerly considered colonies of Western powers, and that the Western powers had a legitimate right to have, suddenly became disfavored by the international community. And the colonies of the Western powers were put on a list of non-self-governing territories that had the right to self-determination. The people of those territories had the right to determine their own future. And in Spain, who had Spanish Sahara back in those days, was being pressured to allow the people of the territory to determine their future. And finally, as Stephen mentioned, in 1974, Spain acquiesced in this and started to arrange for a referendum for the people. However, by this time, Western Sahara's neighbors to the north, Morocco, and to the south, Mauritania, had interposed claims on the territories based upon alleged historic ties between the people of the territory and the rulers of these countries before the Spanish invaded. And they arm twisted the United Nations to hold off on the referendum so that they could prosecute their claims before the International Court of Justice, which they did. And in 1975, the International Court of Justice denied their claims. They went through a lengthy list of all of the arguments that both Morocco and Mauritania gave about these alleged historic ties, and they said that there were no ties sufficient to constitute sovereignty over the territory. Now, Morocco, who was then ruled by King Hassan II, decided they were going to completely ignore this judgment of the Court of Justice, even though they were the ones who petitioned to have it in the first place. And what they did is he organized a mass demonstration of civilians, 350,000 Moroccan civilians, whom he marched down to the border of Western Sahara, and he threatened Spain that if Spain didn't acquiesce in getting out of the territory and letting Morocco and Mauritania own the territory, these civilians would march all the way through and take Western Sahara by force. And when this happened, our esteemed Henry Kissinger got into the act, and he persuaded Spain that the best course of action was for them to acquiesce in this and to withdraw. And that laid the groundwork for what then happened, which was that Morocco and Mauritania invaded the territory with their armies and started a 16-year war between them and the inhabitants of the regions, led by a political group called the Polisario. And we can get into a discussion about what happened after that, but this lays the groundwork about the history of Spain's relationship with the territory and what happened and why it didn't happen the way it should have happened back in 1974.
Stephen, you were going to say something.
I'll just quickly add that the United Nations Security Council did pass a couple of resolutions towards the end of 1975, objecting very strongly to Morocco seizing the territory. In addition to the civilian march, they brought in thousands of troops who brutally suppressed the local population, nearly half of which fled into refugee camps in neighboring Algeria, where they remain to this day. The UN Security Council called for an immediate unconditional Moroccan withdrawal and the recognition of the right of self-determination by the people of Western Sahara. It was a unanimous resolution. I mean, it was pretty hard to vote against, but the United States and France insisted that it remain under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, not Chapter 7, so which prevented any kind of sanctions or any kind of pressure on Morocco. In fact, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was then the US ambassador to the United Nations at that time, said in his autobiography that the task given to me by the State Department was to make the United Nations as ineffective as possible in dealing with this matter. I took upon this assignment with no inconsiderable success. In other words, it was very clear that despite giving lip service to international law, they had, U.S. and France had no intention of enforcing it.
So this is interesting. It's an interesting segue into this next question, which is the role of former Secretary of State James Baker, who in the 90s is brought in by the United Nations to serve in a supposed, say, mediating capacity to bring about some sort of solution. So did something happen that changed US policy, or was this just about what was going on in the UN, and why did Baker not succeed? Let me start with you, Caitlin. You're on mute, Caitlin. You're on mute, Caitlin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
All right. My feeling is that the United States all along was behind whatever Morocco wanted with respect to Western Sahara. I mean, the United States backed Morocco militarily throughout the entire war with the Polisario, the entire 16-year war. And then in 1991, when the UN had brokered a ceasefire agreement between Morocco and Polisario, under which the people of the territory were going to have a referendum. They're finally going to be getting a referendum to decide their future. When MINURSO went down there to conduct this referendum, we didn't get the kind of support from the United States that we should have gotten to make sure that it was a fair referendum that was going to be held. So I think that all the way along the line, this was the United States policy. Now, what happened is because of a lot of pressures, and especially because of the fact that in 1999, MINURSO overcame a lot of the obstacles that were being placed in front of us, and produced a voters list that was considered to be in Polisario's favor. Morocco decided just to pull out of the process entirely. And then everyone scurried around to try to find what they should do at this point. And that's when the idea of autonomy cropped up. where Morocco would offer the people of Western Sahara autonomy within the Moroccan state. And what they did then is they went to former Secretary of State James Baker with the idea that he could come and try to negotiate some sort of agreement with the Polisario under which the Polisario would agree to this autonomy proposal. So Secretary Baker went to the territory with that in mind. However, he quickly realized that the Polisario were not going to agree to this kind of an arrangement, and then tried to develop several plans that would both satisfy the Moroccans' desires and also satisfy the Polisario's desires. But of course, you couldn't do both because they were diametrically opposed to each other. So finally, in 2003, he resigned in total disgust over the matter. But he did really try to come up with some compromise agreement that would satisfy both parties.
And Stephen, that seems to have had some impact on a segment of the Republican Party.
Yes, it's interesting. Baker, of course, served in some important positions in a series of Republican administrations, including Secretary of State under the George H.W. Bush. But his role in Western Sahara was independent of the U.S. government. He was a special envoy for the United Nations Secretary General. And he brought in a number of colleagues, known in Republican circles over the years to serve under him. And during this period, a number of these people served under MINURSO, the United Nations peacekeeping operation that was supposed to oversee this referendum that Morocco had agreed to in 1991 in return for a ceasefire. But frankly, so many of these people got jerked around by the Moroccans, and they saw the grotesque human rights abuses and the restraints put on the MINURSO peacekeepers, that a lot of people ended up having, frankly, a lot of antipathy towards the Moroccan regime. And as a result, some of these people, when their time at the United Nations is over and they're back in the United States, started sharing these stories in certain conservative circles, and they got a support. I mean, some of these people, I got to admit, do so as sort of out of sort of an anti-UN agenda because the United Nations failed so miserably. Though I would argue it's not the UN's fault; it was the fault of the U.S. and France for preventing them to do so. And in addition, when you look at Congress right now, you'll find that in addition to prominent liberals like Senator Pat Leahy or Representative Betty McCollum and various members of the Black Caucus, you'll also find some prominent conservatives, like Jim Inhofe and others who are among the people in Congress who are stressing the importance for the United States to change its pro-Moroccan policy and allow for an act of self-determination.
In 1975, you both identified Moroccans invaded. In 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor. In both cases, acts of aggression supported by the United States. Ultimately, East Timor succeeds in becoming independent after Indonesian occupation and genocidal activity on the part of the Indonesians. And the Western Sahara remains at least 2/3 controlled by Morocco. And the United Nations, if I'm not mistaken, played a role in East Timor's successfully becoming independent. If you could both look at those two situations, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing it, but I'm just curious about what explains these very different outcomes.
For me,
Caitlin, well, go ahead, Stephen.
For me, the primary difference has been the role of global civil society. That in terms of East Timor, you began then to see movements in countries like United States, Australia, Britain, Canada, that were supporting the Indonesians, who are saying who would press their governments to change their policies. That it would publicize the human rights abuses and this flagrant violation of international legal norms. And like the Moroccans, the Indonesians, say, well, we can't pretend it's part of just another part of Indonesia. We can offer them some kind of autonomy. And in the case of East Timor, they actually allowed the people to have a voice in the matter, and they overwhelmingly rejected autonomy in favor of independence. And Indonesia finally agreed, though not without having horrific scorched earth policy, as they finally withdrew in 2000. But I think the main difference really is that Western Sahara just has not gotten the attention that East Timor does. And I think it's really important that the American people and those in other countries that are supporting Morocco recognize that our governments are supporting a flagrant violation of international law. We are supporting the illegal annexation of one country by another. And this is illegitimate, that people like people in non-self-governing territories have the right to for self-determination. I mean, this autonomy proposal by Morocco, which Trump and many Democrats, unfortunately, have also spoken positively of, is not only vague in terms of what kind of constitutes autonomy, but it rules out the option of independence. But as a non-self-governing territory under international law, they must have that option. Otherwise, it's not an act of self-determination. And so it's really important that we kind of expose this, because again, Morocco, they've liberalized somewhat on the domestically in the past 20 years, but the human rights situation in the occupied Western Sahara is atrocious. Freedom House, their annual report on freedom in the world, put Western Sahara is among the worst 6 or 8 countries in the world, up there with Tajikistan, North Korea, Tibet, I mean, it's just
number 2, right after Syria.
Yeah, I mean, just really, really horrible. And similarly, when we think of autocratic regimes that promised autonomy to ethnically distinct regions like Ethiopia and Eritrea and Serbia with Kosovo, they ended up revoking them when we had these horrific wars and subsequent conflicts. And so it's just real important that those who support international law and human rights press our governments to stop supporting. Because if it weren't for the threat of veto power, if it weren't for the military aid and training and everything that countries like the United States, France provide Morocco, they wouldn't be able to get away with it. And it was just this kind of pressure was really what made the critical difference. I think
I'm going to want to come back to that a little bit later in this interview, because that really does go to what people can do right now and why inaction is unacceptable. But before we do, I want to just ask a little bit more in terms of background. Caitlin, so when Baker's efforts collapsed and the only thing that was being offered by Morocco was autonomy, what happened between then and the breakdown in the ceasefire this past November? Were negotiations underway?
Well, there were pseudo negotiations. People got together in a room and talked, but nothing was accomplished, and nothing could be accomplished because Morocco refused to budge from its autonomy proposal, which would exclude the option of independence ever for the Sahrawis. And the Polisario, representing the Sahrawis, wouldn't accept anything that would exclude the option of independence. So they sat and talked and talked and talked, and nothing ever happened. And I think that what did happen, however, is a huge buildup of anxiety and antipathy towards the international community among the Sahrawi youth, and a lot of pressure among Sahrawi youth to do something to break this deadlock, and in particular, to resume an armed conflict. And I think it was as a result of this pressure almost as much as any particular incident, that the Polisario eventually last year declared the ceasefire ended. Because all along, the ceasefire was supposed to be because of a referendum. If you remove the referendum from the table, then why was there a ceasefire? And so the Polisario have just decided, okay, if you're not going to give us what you promised us in 1991, then we're not going to give you what we promised you either. We're going to remove our agreement to have a ceasefire, and we're going to resume the conflict. And that's precisely what happened.
So let's talk about when it broke down. What was the incident that triggered the actual collapse of the ceasefire? Caitlin?
There is a region of the territory near the berm. The berm is the wall that Morocco built to separate its part of the territory from the Polisario part of the territory. In that region that borders Mauritania, Morocco had been using a corridor there to get supplies and other things back and forth between Western Sahara and Mauritania. Now, this was supposed to be a buffer zone where neither of the parties were supposed to engage in activities. And when this went on for a period of time, the Polisario objected. And eventually, some of the civilian population of both Western Sahara and the Polisario camps went to this area and camped out in protest. And that started a violent confrontation with the Moroccans, and eventually the Polisario came in to protect the settlers, the civilians who were there. And when they decided that, okay, if Morocco is going to be breaching its agreement under the ceasefire, we're going to state that the ceasefire is eliminated. So that was the incident itself that precipitated it. But as I said, I think that the buildup of this resentment and anger among Sahrawi youth is really behind what happened.
Thank you. I'd like you both to help us understand some of the players, not just the Polisario, which is the front leading the struggle and within what now is the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and Morocco. But who are the other players and what are their interests in this? What is interests of the United States, France, Spain, Algeria, not to mention international institutions like the AU and the African Union and the United Nations? What is the interest of these different players in this conflict?
Start with Africa. The African Union, formerly known as the Organization for African Unity, has had as one of its principal planks that as arbitrary as some of the colonial boundaries in Africa may be, that no country can unilaterally try to change them. If there's any adjustment in the borders, it has to be mutually agreed upon. And that was an important principle because, without that, the whole continent could, break out in chaos and perpetual war. And so when Morocco violated that agreement, the majority of countries in what was then the OAU was very clear that that was not permissible, that Morocco had to grant them the right of self-determination, just like any other former African colony. And when Morocco refused to agree to do so, or even just to negotiate in good faith, in the early 1980s, the OAU recognized Western Sahara, which was formerly known as the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. That was declared in early 1976 to be a full member state, and they've been a full member state ever since. And they find this as an important anti-colonial struggle. They have been the primary supporter of the right of self-determination. Algeria has been particularly vehement in its support of the Polisario. In fact, in many ways, Polisario has been very dependent on the Algerians for financial support for their diplomatic offices, for allowing them to essentially run the refugee camps as autonomous areas within the country and under Polisario control, and they provide them with military aid over the years. And this is part of both given their revolutionary heritage, they certainly have a particular concern with the right of self-determination, given the history of the struggle against French colonialism. But also, they are the major regional rival of Morocco and have been there since independence, when Morocco tried to invade Western Algeria. So Morocco's claim of Western Sahara is part of this vision of La Grande Maroc, Greater Morocco. That would include Western Algeria, all of Mauritania, northern Mali. It definitely have an expansionist ideology there. But at the same time, I think it's important to emphasize that the Moroccan claim that the Polisario is a creation of Algeria or a puppet of Algeria, or just doing the bidding of Algeria, is completely ahistorical. And for one thing, the Algerians support a rival nationalist movement back during the anti-colonial struggle against Spain. But even if all Algerian support was cut off tomorrow, even though it would certainly cripple the Polisario, the struggle will continue. It's an indigenous struggle. They clearly have the support of the majority of the Sahrawi population. And so I would challenge the line by Morocco and its supporters that deny agency to the Sahrawis. Moving on to Europe, you have France is the former colonial power in Morocco. They have very close strategic and economic interests. The French have a long history of supporting autocratic allies on the African continent, regardless of their violations of human rights and the like. I'd argue that French, even more so than the Americans, are a major obstacle to the allowing for an act of self-determination to take place. The Spaniards, there's some real divisions within Spain about what should happen. There's a strong movement, especially in the grassroots, among for Spain to live up to its obligation and to, like the Portuguese eventually did with East Timor, play a leading role in pushing for the right of self-determination, because legally Spain is still the colonial, is still the power there. But unfortunately, Spain, because of their conflicts with Morocco regarding the two presidios, these small Spanish enclaves on the north coast of Algeria, as well as fear that Moroccans will open the floodgates of undocumented immigrants across the narrow passage separating Morocco and Spain. Not to mention, again, various financial and other interests. Spain has refused to take much leadership as well. And finally, in terms of the United States, the Polisarios moderated their policies. Are not as far left as they used to be. They stress their belief in liberal democracy and liberal economy, and bent over back. And unlike in some national liberation struggles, they've never engaged in terrorism. They've really tried to put a good face on to the West, that they're not a threat. And personally, I think it's less a matter that that Western nations are afraid of an independent Western Sahara per se, as they are if there was a free and fair referendum, which Morocco would almost certainly lose. The Moroccan public would be so outraged that they've been lied to all these years, that the Sahrawis welcome their liberation by Morocco, that they put in so much sacrifice in terms of lives and money to hold on to the territory, that it would just add to the grievances against the corrupt autocratic royal family, and could potentially destabilize this pro-Western government. So my guess is that's actually at this point the primary reason that Western support continues for the occupation.
I might add military support as well, because the United States has always had a rather dubious military alliance with Morocco, dating back to the time of Henry Kissinger, when Kissinger organized what they called the Safari Club of countries who would act as surrogates for attacking liberty movements in Africa that the United States couldn't do officially. So they would get these surrogate countries to do it. And one of those surrogates was Morocco. And Morocco did get involved in Angola and a lot of the other disputes, conflicts during that era. Also, since that time, Morocco has been one of the key countries for renditions. When the United States finds it politically unwise to torture captives of one sort or another, they can send them over to Morocco. Morocco doesn't have any such qualms. So Morocco has had a strong alliance with the US military for a lot of good reasons and bad reasons for all this period of time.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at then the situation today and what needs to be done. The war has recommenced. Morocco continues to suggest that Polisario is somehow in league with Al Qaeda in the Maghreb and with Daesh. Where do we go from here? I want to start with you, Caitlin. Where do we go?
Well, it's not true. And in fact, if you talk to State Department people and Department of Defense people, they know very well it's not true. I mean, this is a lot of propaganda from Morocco. And Morocco spends, at one time, $3 million a year hiring lobbyists in the United States to twist the facts around to support Morocco's claims. And one of Morocco's main claims nowadays is that the Polisario are a leftist group that are pro-Islamic terrorists. And if they were to get a hold of Western Sahara, it would be a haven for these Al-Qaeda type terrorists throughout the entire region of Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's totally false. And everyone of the hierarchy of the United States government really knows that.
And I would add, I mean, the charges are contradictory. They say they're communists, and they say they're pro-Gaddafi, and they say they're pro-Hezbollah, and they say pro-Al-Qaeda. I mean, all these groups, these entities and groups that are in conflict with each other, somehow the Polisario is in league with all of them. And again, they're actually quite moderate organization. And I mean, I have my critiques of some of their policies and some things that go on in the camps, but they're generally one of the most well organized and most pluralistic and least terrorist inclined of any movements in North Africa and the Middle East I've encountered. Indeed, both their own policies and historically in Sahrawi culture, they practice a pretty liberal interpretation of Islam. Women have equal rights to inheritance and divorce. Women keep their maiden names. They're in leadership position, particularly in the nonviolent resistance inside the occupied territories, but even in the Polisario itself. In fact, Sahrawi women are particularly targeted by Moroccan occupation forces because they're considered uppity, by Moroccan standards in terms of sexual abuse and torture in the prisons and that sort of set, and that's that sort of thing. So, there's absolutely no credibility to the charges of Polisario's connections to extremism. I'm sorry, I forgot the other part of your question.
Well, no, actually, this is very helpful because the other part, which I want to ask both of you, is where do we go from here and what needs to be done? I have been struck in discussions with people, including among US African Americans in leading roles that are, liberal to progressive, that when the issue of the Western Sahara comes up, either people have no idea what's going on or they remain strangely silent. And I've been trying to figure out what's motivating that and what does it tell us that needs to be done? And why don't we focus on that as we move towards wrapping up this discussion? So I'd like both of you to respond to that because I've really been trying to grapple with that question. Caitlin, do you want to start?
Well, I think what I said a few minutes ago is at the root of some of this, and that is that Morocco has spent eons of money throughout the years to try to propagate its view about this struggle and to convince people that it's on the right side and the Polisario on the bad side of the issue for all kinds of different reasons. And the Polisario don't have the means to counter some of this propaganda. Only civil society, such as us and other people who know about the issue, can go out and actually discuss the issue. Let me give you an example. One of the things that Morocco says that I'm the most angry about is that they withdrew from the referendum process in 2000 because there were disagreements among the parties about the criteria for voter eligibility. This is total hogwash. There was never any disagreements about the eligibility criteria. In fact, the criteria that we used in MINURSO were proposed by Morocco back when the MINURSO was originally organized. Initially, the plan was that the people who were going to vote were the people who were on a census organized by the Spanish back in 1974. And Morocco successfully lobbied for the criteria to be increased to 5 different bases, which were accepted by the Polisario. And these were the bases upon which we organized these interview sessions and we prepared the voters list. So Morocco was just trying to find an excuse that it can use to convince the international community that there was no way that they could have a referendum. Poor Morocco. Morocco wanted to have a referendum, but it's impossible. So now we have to look for another way. That's totally untrue. And Morocco gets people to believe these things because it spends the money to propagate all of these issues that the other side doesn't have. So the only way we can counter that is by amassing a number of people who will go out there and tell the truth.
But again, like
Yes.
the issue of East Timor, it was that activists effectively shamed their governments into ending their support for the Indonesian occupation. I mean, there are a lot of complex issues in the world, but something as fundamental as the country upping and invading a neighbor is something that we really should that you shouldn't get away with. I mean, we thought we'd resolve this in 1945 with the United Nations Charter, and yet but we now have President Trump, who not only formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region of Syria, but he in December, in his final months of office, recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara. And that's even more serious because, as I say, the Western Sahara has been recognized by more than 80 countries at one time or another. It's a full member of the African Union. Trump was essentially endorsing the takeover of one recognized African country by another. This is a very dangerous precedent. And this is why Western Sahara is so important. I mean, it's a fairly small country overall. We're talking about 250,000 people. It's not huge, but what's important is that the fundamental international legal order. Because if Morocco gets away with this, as the U.S. and France and others seem to want, it'll be the first time since the ratification of the United Nations Charter that a country has gotten away with expanding its territory by force. It would be the first time that a colony has not been granted the right of self-determination. This is a very dangerous precedent. That's why a lot of the more right-wing elements supporting the Israeli occupation are also very pro-Moroccan because they want that precedent. They want because they want to annex large parts of the West Bank and the like as well. And so that's why it's really, really important that it doesn't matter if you care about the Western Saharans per se. And personally, I don't care if they are independent or they become part of Morocco, as long as they have that choice, as long as they exercise their right of self-determination, which is currently being denied to them. And what is really disturbing is that many of us assumed that Biden, with the stroke of a pen, could say, no, we won't recognize the takeover of one African nation by another. But so far, with questions to Secretary of State Blinken and other officials, they said, oh, we're still thinking about it or whatever. And for now, the policy remains the same. The maps in the US Embassy in Rabat show Western Sahara as part of Morocco. The embassies, we're setting up a consulate in Dakhla in the occupied territories. In fact, officials in the US Embassy went down there a couple of weeks ago for a workshop for young Moroccan leaders, in the effort to try to assimilate the Sahrawis into Moroccan society. And this is a very, very dangerous precedent that we really do need to challenge, because again, if Morocco gets away with this annexation, if the United States is as the very first major country to recognize the takeover, the implications for Palestine, Crimea, countries, other occupied territories around. This is a very serious matter that needs to be addressed by anyone who cares about post-World War II the international legal order, because that's what's at stake right here.
Yeah,
Caitlin,
Bill, there are two important reasons why Americans should be concerned about this. I have worked for over 30 years in Middle Eastern countries and with Middle Eastern people. And I know what the people on the street say about the United States. And it isn't necessarily what the leaders say to US diplomats or what the majority of the people in the United States think these people think. And you'd be struck by the fact that there's so much disrespect among the populations of these countries for the United States, because we don't live up to what we say we're going to live up to in our principles. And I think that one of the major reasons why Islamic radicals are attractive to a lot of youthful people in this area are because they believe that the United States will not stand up for the principles of democracy, self-determination, law and order, international law, all of these principles that we say we believe in. So if we really want to stem the attractiveness of Islamic radicals, the best way we can do it is by standing up for the principles that we espouse. And this is a prime example. It couldn't be a more clear-cut example of where we could stand up for principles that we say we espouse and support the Sahrawi cause and counter some of the appeal of these radicals in the Islamic world. The second reason is that the Polisario and the Sahrawis want to set up a democratic society, which would be the first truly democratic Muslim Arab society in the world, where women have a prominent role in the society, where they have a constitution that guarantees people a lot of the freedoms we enjoy in the United States. And this is not something that's just a pie in the sky idea. They put into practice a lot of these principles already in the refugee camps that they have in Algeria. So we know what kind of society they would create if they were allowed to have an independent Western Sahara. This would be an amazing precedent for the rest of the world, and something the United States has said it wanted to see accomplished for eons, and it could be done if the United States adopts the right policy with respect to Western Sahara.
Thank you. Stephen, you were going to say something?
Oh, she just said in the second part, okay. Actually, that the irony that we say we want a democratic, secular, Arab Muslim nation, and yet we're supporting an authoritarian, patriarchal, of government and suppressing that those who want to create that.
So, Caitlin, Thomas, Stephen Zunis, thank you very, very much for joining us. This is great, and the struggle continues. Thanks very much.